Chapter 1. The Origins of the Cold War. A world remade, you awaken in the aftermath of a global storm. Cities lie in ruins. Nations are weary. The year is 1945, and World War II has just ended. But as the dust settles, another, colder war begins. To take shape, one that will not be fought with tanks and trenches, but with ideology, fear, espionage, and the ever-looming threat of annihilation. A world victorious, yet divided, you stand at the edge of a new world. Nazi Germany has fallen. Imperial Japan lies shattered. The Axis powers are no more. But instead of unity, the victors eye each other with suspicion. The United States, armed with nuclear firepower and economic might, emerges as a global superpower determined to uphold democracy and capitalism. On the other side stands the Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, driven by communist ideals and a deep distrust of the West. They had fought a common enemy. Now they prepare to face each other. The fragile alliance that was never meant to last at Yalta and Potsdam, you watch Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sit around polished tables, carving up the post-war order like surgeons dividing a wounded body. In these rooms, beneath formal language and diplomatic smiles, the seeds of the Cold War are quietly sown. You hear promises made and promises broken. Free elections in Eastern Europe, Stalin agrees. But soon, you realize those elections will never come. To the Soviets, the Red Army is not just a liberator, it is a symbol of domination. One by one, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany fall under Soviet control. A curtain is descending, and behind it lies a block of nations forced to mirror Moscow. Two visions of the world as the globe reshapes itself, you find. Yourself pulled between two visions of reality. The American vision speaks of freedom, free markets, and open societies. It is the world of Wall Street, Hollywood, and the United Nations. But it also comes with military bases, economic influence, and a deep suspicion of any red flag bearing a hammer and sickle. The Soviet vision offers equality, centralized planning, and liberation from capitalist exploitation. Yet it demands obedience, silence, and submission to the state. You begin to understand, this is not just a geopolitical rivalry, it is an ideological crusade. From allies to adversaries, by 1946, the transformation is complete. Churchill travels to Fulton, Missouri. You sit in the audience as he declares, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This is no longer a war of guns. It is a war of lines drawn in the sand." President Truman, watching the Soviet grip tighten across Eastern Europe, introduces what will become the Truman Doctrine, a pledge to support free peoples resisting subjugation. Greece and Turkey are first. Billions in aid flow to contain communism's spread. The Soviet response? Denial, denunciation, and deeper entrenchment. You feel the tension build. Fear becomes the currency of power. The Marshall Plan, dollars. Against doctrine in 1947, you watch Europe still smoldering, factories in ruin, fields barren, millions displaced. Into this devastation steps George Marshall, U.S. Secretary of State. He proposes a bold plan, massive financial aid to rebuild European economies and prevent communism's appeal from taking root. 16 nations accept. The Soviet Union and its satellites refuse. You witness two Europes form before your eyes. In the West, recovery, prosperity, Coca-Cola, and jazz. In the East, shortages, surveillance, and slogans of the revolution. The divide is no longer theoretical, it's physical, and you are standing in the middle. Berlin, the first flashpoint Berlin, divided city, broken capital. In 1948, you stand in its center, a place where ideology collides at every checkpoint. The Western Allies merge their zones. The Soviets respond with a blockade, hoping to starve West Berlin into submission. But you hear the roar of propellers. For nearly a year, American and British planes fly around the clock, bringing food, coal, medicine. It is the Berlin airlift, and it keeps hope alive. The blockade fails, but so too does any hope of reconciliation. Two Germanys are born, and Berlin, once a symbol of Nazi defeat, becomes ground zero of a new confrontation. Fear becomes policy in Washington. You hear the clatter of typewriters and the whisper of strategy. The National Security Council drafts NSC 68, a top-secret report calling for a massive buildup of American military power to counter the Soviet threat. The enemy is now everywhere, in Asia, in Africa, in your universities, even in your own home. In Moscow, the Kremlin builds its own arsenal, trains its own spies, and begins to export revolution across the globe. You realize this Cold War is not cold at all. It burns silently, in proxy wars, intelligence battles, and psychological campaigns. The nuclear shadow, then comes the unthinkable. In 1949, the Soviet Union tests its first atomic bomb. The balance of terror shifts. No longer does the US hold exclusive control over nuclear apocalypse. You live under a sky where clouds could become mushrooms in minutes. School children practice duck and cover drills. Cities build fallout shelters. Strategists speak in cold, clinical terms. Megatons. Blast radius, first strike, second strike. Peace, it seems, depends not on goodwill but on mutual destruction. The Cold War begins in earnest by 1950. There is no longer room for illusion. You witness the outbreak of the Korean War, the first military clash of the Cold War. North versus South. Communism. Capitalism. The US fights under the UN banner. China enters to support the North. Millions die. The border remains. The Cold War is no longer a threat. It is a reality. It infiltrates politics, culture, science, art, and daily life. And you, caught between the propaganda and the paranoia, begin to feel the weight of a divided world. What you carry forward. You walk away from this chapter not with answers, but with an awareness that the Cold War was born not out of greed or madness, but out of fear. That two superpowers, both victims and victors, stood at the pinnacle of history and saw each other as threats rather than partners. That peace is not simply the absence of war, but the presence of trust. As you leave the ruins of World War II, behind you carry forward the burden of this new conflict. One not fought in trenches, but in hearts, minds, and shadows. The Cold War has begun, and so have you. Chapter 2. The Iron Curtain. Europe divided. Humanity split. You stand in the heart of Europe, and it no longer feels like one continent. The echoes of World War II still linger, but new walls, some visible, others invisible, are rising fast. You are a witness to one of history's greatest divides, and you don't yet realize how long it will last, or how deeply it will shape every life it touches, including your own. A curtain falls across the continent. It is March 5th, 1946. You sit in a crowded hall at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. The air smells of dust and old wood. The man at the podium is Winston Churchill. He clears his throat, looks straight into the future, and speaks words that will become immortal. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. You don't know it yet, but you've just heard the eulogy for a united Europe. The Iron Curtain isn't made of steel. It has no hinges, no locks, no gates, and yet it is impenetrable. It cuts through towns, fields, rivers, and families. It splits not only countries, but consciousness. To the west, freedom of press, multi-party democracy, and open borders. To the east, censorship, secret police, and the cold machinery of one-party rule. You now live in a world where neighbors across the street may as well be on the other side of the moon. Stalin's buffer zone in Moscow. Joseph Stalin is not building walls for the sake of ambition alone. He remembers too well the invasions. Napoleon in the 19th century, Hitler in the 20th. He doesn't trust the West, and the West doesn't trust him. You watch as the Red Army remains stationed in Eastern Europe, long after the last German soldier has surrendered. At first it's subtle. Friendly people's committees form, then communist parties receive special support. Soon elections are manipulated, dissenters are silenced, and rival parties are outlawed. One by one, the liberated nations fall into Soviet orbit. Poland, promised free elections, ends up with Soviet puppets. Hungary, after brief resistance, purges its social democrats. Czechoslovakia in 1948 suffers a bloodless coup, known as the Prague coup, and becomes a one-party state overnight. You feel the suffocation spreading. These aren't conquests in the traditional sense. No tanks roll in, no flags are raised in flames. It is slower, more calculated, a political annexation masked as revolution. The West responds, containment begins. You hear the alarm bells ringing in Washington and London. They call it Soviet expansionism, and to stop it they coin a new doctrine, containment. George Kennan, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow, sends a long telegram, 8,000 words of clarity and warning. His message: the USSR is inherently expansionist and must be checked through firm, patient resistance. From this seed, a global strategy blooms, and you begin to see it take form. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine is announced. It offers aid to any country resisting communism, starting with Greece and Turkey, where civil wars threaten Western influence. Billions are funneled not just for defense, but for rebuilding, stabilizing, persuading. In your lifetime, money becomes a weapon, food becomes a message, even friendship becomes strategy. The Cold War, you realize, is not just about who has the bigger bomb, it's about who wins hearts and who can afford to. Berlin, a city, a symbol, a scar nowhere, is this division more literal than in Berlin? The city, like Germany itself, is carved into zones by the Allies. The Soviet sector becomes East Berlin. The American, British, and French zones merge into West Berlin. But Berlin is deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany, a western island in a communist sea. In 1948, Stalin tries to squeeze it out. You live through the Berlin Blockade. Roads are shut, railways are cut, electricity is disrupted. It is a siege without bullets. But then the planes come. For 11 months, Western powers fly in everything: milk, coal, medicine, chocolate. Over 200,000 flights. You stand at Tempelhof Airport and watch children wave as crates drop from the skies. The message is clear: Berlin will not fall. When the blockade ends in May 1949, the world knows this city is more than a map coordinate. It is the pressure point of the planet. It is where the Cold War lives and breathes. Two Europes, two futures. In May 1949, in response to growing Soviet aggression, 12 Western nations, including the US, UK, France, and Italy, sign the EE North Atlantic Treaty. NATO is born, pledging collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. This is not just military, it is symbolic. The West has drawn its line in the sand. In October 1949, the Soviets respond with the formal creation of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. A few months earlier, the West had established the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Germany is now officially split. Two nations, two ideologies, two armies. The arms race escalates. Conscription returns. Borders harden. You carry a passport, but more importantly, you carry alignment. Which side are you on? You can no longer remain neutral, not in speech, not in thought, not even in silence. Life behind the curtain. If you are born on the eastern side of the curtain, your life is charted from birth. Your education is political. Your job is assigned. Your mail is read. Your friends disappear quietly if they say too much. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, builds one of the most invasive surveillance systems the world has ever known. People vanish, not in the dead of night, but in broad daylight. No trial, no news, just silence. Your television plays only one channel. Your books are censored. Your choices are limits dressed as options. Yet not all is misery. There is housing, healthcare, employment. But the price is high: obedience. You grow up with maps that have blank spots. You are taught that the West is evil, greedy, imperialist, and you believe it, until you hear Western music crackling faintly through illegal radios, a forbidden guitar riff, a voice from across the curtain, and something in you begins to stir. Life in the West. Freedom with strings across the divide. In Western Europe, things are different, but not always easy. The Marshall Plan injects over $13 billion into rebuilding economies. You watch cities rise from rubble. Paris lights up again. Rome buzzes. West Germany becomes an industrial powerhouse. But this prosperity is tied to American influence. US military bases dot the countryside. American movies fill cinemas. Coca-Cola becomes more than a drink, it's a symbol. With every truck of aid, every film reel, every jazz record, a message is delivered. This is what freedom looks like. Yet freedom brings choices, and choices bring risk. Communist parties remain strong in France and Italy. Strikes erupt, students protest. Not everyone trusts the American version of democracy. You realize, while the East controls by force, the West persuades by presence, and presence is power. Espionage and the culture of suspicion. The Iron Curtain does not just divide nations, it divides minds. You live in an age of spies and double agents. CIA and KGB operatives lurk in embassies and cafes. Secrets are stolen in microfilm. Betrayals happen over coffee. In your neighborhood, anyone might be listening. At your university, loyalty is questioned. You begin to censor your own thoughts before speaking. In America, Senator Joseph McCarthy hunts communists with a theatrical vengeance. Careers are ruined, lives destroyed. Loyalty oaths become part of everyday bureaucracy. The fear is real, and so is the manipulation. The Cold War, you see, thrives not just on weapons, but on paranoia. The division becomes the norm by the early 1950s. The division of Europe feels permanent. Generations are growing up who have never known a united continent. You take trains that stop at concrete walls. You send letters that never arrive. You visit family with permits and under guard. Maps now show the world in two colors, red and blue. Red for communism, blue for capitalism. You live not on land, but on fault lines. The Cold War is no longer a reaction, it is an institution. P. A curtain that cuts through humanity. And yet, even as the wall rises, it does not always divide the human heart. East Germans risk their lives to escape. Some dig tunnels, some jump from windows, some die trying. In the West, voices rise in protest, not just against the East, but against complacency and consumerism. Artists, poets, students, they question everything, even the system that gives them the right to question. The Iron Curtain divides governments, economies, armies, but it cannot completely divide longing. Longing for truth, longing for unity. Longing for something beyond flags and speeches. Closing reflection. You stand again at the edge of Europe. The curtain is still there. It cuts through forests, fields, and families. But now you see it for what it truly is. A monument to fear. Prison of ideologies. A failure of understanding. The Iron Curtain was not inevitable. It was not made of steel. It was made of choices, and it will take generations to undo. Chapter 3. The Arms Race. Beneath the shadow of annihilation, you wake each morning under a sky that could catch fire at any moment. You carry on with your life, go to work, read the paper, feed your children, but something heavy sits in the back of your mind. You know the world can end in minutes, not years. The sun could rise today only to be swallowed by a mushroom cloud tomorrow. This is the Cold War's cruelest paradox. Peace maintained not by love or reason, but by fear of total destruction. The bomb that changed everything, it begins in the deserts of New Mexico. In July 1945, before the world has even tasted peace, you witness the first atomic bomb explode at the Trinity test site. A flash of blinding light, a tower of fire, a silence so deep it echoes. It is awe-inspiring and horrifying. Oppenheimer, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, whispers, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Only weeks later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki fall. You see the photographs. Shadows of humans burned into stone. Cities flattened into ash. Over 200,000 dead. For the first time in history, a single bomb can erase a city, and with it, a future. At first, the United States alone holds this terrible power, but that monopoly does not last. The Soviets strike back in 1949, you read the headlines. The Soviet Union has detonated an atomic bomb. The impossible has become real. American scientists are stunned. Intelligence officials are embarrassed. The US had believed it had at least 5 more years. But Stalin, with help from Soviet spies embedded in the Manhattan Project, people like Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs, had accelerated Soviet nuclear development. The world is no longer unipolar. The arms race has begun. Now, both superpowers can destroy each other, but rather than recoil in terror, they escalate. Faster, deadlier, bigger. The hydrogen bomb. Terror. Redefined. You hear whispers in the corridors of Washington and Moscow, scientists arguing over something more powerful than the atomic bomb. In 1952, the United States tests the first hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear device over 500 times more powerful than the one dropped on Nagasaki. The explosion vaporizes an island in the Pacific. Just 1 year later, the Soviet Union follows suit with its own H-bomb. The race is no longer about if, but how many, how fast, and how accurate. These are not weapons of war. They are instruments of extinction. The term mutually assured destruction enters military vocabulary. It becomes doctrine, strategy, religion. If one side launches, both sides perish. And so you live in a world where the unthinkable is the only thing keeping the peace. Living with the bomb, it is not only world leaders who bear this burden. You carry it too. You remember the 1950s when civil defense drills become routine. Duck and cover, the teacher says, and you hide under your desk. Sirens wail across cities. Shelters are built in suburban basements. Radiation pills are handed out like aspirin. Television ads show cheerful families stocking canned goods in fallout bunkers. You pretend it's all normal, but deep down, you know better. The threat is constant. Nuclear war isn't science fiction. It's policy, it's math. It's something that might happen tonight because of a radar glitch, a false alarm, a diplomatic slip, or a twitch in a tired general's hand. You don't live in peace. You live in suspense. The doctrine of massive retaliation in 1954, the US Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, unveils a chilling strategy: massive retaliation. Any Soviet aggression, big or small, would be met with overwhelming nuclear force it is meant to deter. But to you it sounds like a suicide pact, a minor skirmish on the German border, total annihilation, a misread signal, millions dead. The Cold War becomes a game of chicken, with nuclear-tipped missiles instead of headlights. In Moscow, Khrushchev responds in kind. He proclaims, "We will bury you," not with guns, but with ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach New York or Los Angeles in 30 minutes. The Atlantic and Pacific are no longer moats. Geography is meaningless now. You live in a world where death can arrive before your coffee cools. Sputnik and the space race in 1957, a new kind of fear pierces the sky. The Soviets launch Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It's a metal sphere the size of a beach ball, but it might as well be a bomb. It beeps as it orbits the Earth over and over, unchallenged. You watch Americans stare upward in disbelief. The implications are terrifying. If they can put a satellite into orbit, they can deliver a nuclear warhead across continents. The US scrambles to catch up. Schools double down on math and science. NASA is born. The space race is not about exploration. It's about supremacy, the pie. Cold War has left Earth. It now races across the stars. Deterrence becomes a way of life by the early 1960s. Both superpowers have enough bombs to destroy the planet several times over. Overkill capacity, they call it. You wonder, how many times does a civilization need to die? The logic is cruel and simple. The more weapons each side has, the less likely either is to use them. This twisted balance is called deterrence, and so the stockpiles grow. Nuclear submarines roam silently beneath the oceans, able to strike from anywhere. Strategic bombers circle the skies 24/7. Underground missile silos dot the American Midwest, each with keys that unlock Armageddon. This is the age of second strike capability, the guarantee that even if attacked first, you can respond with equal or greater force. You don't aim to win, you aim to ensure that everyone loses. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days to midnight. Then it almost happens. In October 1962, US spy planes discover Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. You remember those 13 days. The world holds its breath. President Kennedy demands their removal. Nikita Khrushchev refuses. The US Navy imposes a blockade. Warships stare each other down in the Caribbean. You live every day as if it might be the last. At school, children write letters to the president begging him to stop the war. In bunkers, families pray. In military bases, fingers hover over launch buttons. And then, miraculously, it ends. Khrushchev backs down in exchange for a secret US promise to remove missiles from Turkey. The world exhales, but the message is clear. The edge is real. And we almost went over. From brinkmanship to control after the Cuban Missile Crisis, something changes. The leaders, scarred by the nearness of catastrophe, begin to talk, not with threats, but with pens. In 1963, the Hotline Agreement is signed, a direct line between Washington and Moscow, so that next time they speak before they strike. Then comes the Partial Test Ban Treaty, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. It is small, but it is a start. You witness a strange shift. While the stockpiles grow, so does the desire to limit them. It's as if both sides finally understand. The longer this game continues, the greater the odds it ends in ash. Ken, living under the shadow still, you do not feel safe. You feel suspended. Television shows depict nuclear war as an inevitable backdrop. Films like Dr. Strangelove mock the absurdity of military planning. Books like On the Beach and Failsafe imagine the end not as drama, but as dust. Even your dreams are haunted by the silent countdown. Children grow up drawing missiles instead of animals. Families argue over whether to build shelters or simply live normally. The Cold War teaches you a new kind of grief, anticipatory grief. Mourning a world that hasn't ended but might at any moment. You don't live in war, but you never live in peace. Science and the morality of power in universities and laboratories, the scientists who built these weapons begin to speak out. Oppenheimer, haunted by what he helped unleash, is stripped of his security clearance. Einstein calls the nuclear age a crisis of morality. You ask yourself, can a society survive while threatening its own destruction? Nuclear power brings promises too, electricity, medicine, progress. But the shadow of the bomb taints it all. The Cold War becomes not just a political struggle, but a philosophical one. Are we rational enough to manage the irrational? Are we capable of restraint? Or are we simply building better ways to die? Closing reflection, you sit by your window, watching the sunset over a quiet town. Somewhere, deep underground or out at sea, a missile waits, cold, silent, obedient. It does not hate you. It does not question orders, it simply waits. This is the world the arms race has built, not a world of fire and rubble, not yet, but a world held in tension, where civilization depends on discipline, machines, and the hope that men with power will not blink. You live in a world where peace is possible, but never guaranteed, and you wonder, how long can we live under the shadow before the sky falls? Chapter 4. Proxy Wars. Battlegrounds of ideology. You never see the missiles fall on your hometown. You never hear the sirens scream through your street. And yet the Cold War is not a cold one, not for the world beyond Washington or Moscow. The war is fought in jungles, deserts, mountains, not with nuclear weapons, but with rifles, bombs, and bodies. This is the theater of proxy wars, where the superpowers send others to bleed in their place, where young men fight and die not for their country, but for someone else's idea of freedom or control. You think you're at peace, but you live in a world on fire. What is a proxy war? A bullet in Vietnam, a coup in Chile, a guerrilla uprising in Angola. You may never hold a weapon, but the Cold War touches everything. The United States and the Soviet Union cannot confront each other directly. The stakes are too high. Nuclear war looms too close. So they fight indirectly, by supporting, funding, arming, and manipulating smaller states and rebel movements. These are the proxy wars, conflicts instigated or intensified by the superpowers, fought by third parties. They are not accidents. They are strategic choices. Each war becomes a test case, each victory a symbolic triumph, each loss a blow to global prestige. Ideology, not territory, is the prize, and human lives are the cost. Korea, the forgotten. War it begins with a divided peninsula. In 1950, North Korea, armed and backed by the Soviet Union and China, crosses the 38th parallel and invades the south. The United States, under the UN flag, intervenes. You see tanks rolling into mud, jet fighters screaming across the skies, and bodies frozen in the Korean winter. This is not a civil war. It is a proxy war. It's the first time American and Soviet-backed forces fight directly through surrogates. Chinese troops flood across the Yalu River. US Marines hold the Pusan perimeter. Seoul changes hands multiple times, 3 years, millions dead. And the result? A return to the status quo. The border barely moves, but the world does. You learn that peace is temporary, but proxy wars are not. Vietnam, the jungle that swallowed. Empire's Vietnam is not just a war, it is a wound. You watch American boys, barely out of high school, airlifted into rice paddies and dense jungles, chasing an invisible enemy. You hear the helicopters, you see the napalm. You witness villages burned to ashes in the name of stopping communism. It begins as a colonial struggle. The French fail. Then the Americans take over. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, is backed by the Soviets and China. The South, propped up by US money, bombs and soldiers, spirals into chaos. The more you try to control it, the more it slips away. You realize that ideology doesn't hold when the language, terrain and history are not yours. At home, protests erupt. Make love, not war, echoes in city streets. Kent State, Tet Offensive. The My Lai Massacre. Vietnam becomes a symbol, not of victory but of imperial overreach. And when the last helicopter lifts off from Saigon in 1975, you feel it. America has lost. Not just a war, but its innocence. Afghanistan. The Soviet Vietnam years later, the tables turn. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, hoping to stabilize a friendly communist regime. But like the Americans in Vietnam, the Soviets soon find themselves bogged down in a land they do not understand. You watch as mountain tribes, the Mujahideen, rise against them. Funded, trained and armed by the CIA and Saudi Arabia, they fight with a zeal that no tank can crush. The US sends Stinger missiles and Soviet helicopters begin to fall from the sky. You realize today's freedom fighters can become tomorrow's enemies. The Mujahideen will not forget, nor will they forgive. After a decade of blood and ruin, the Soviets withdraw. Afghanistan becomes rubble. And the seeds of future terror are planted. You wonder if the Cold War ever really ends for those it touches. Latin America. The quiet wars in Latin America, the battleground is quieter, but no less cruel. You see democracies overthrown and replaced with juntas, farmers branded as communists, students disappeared, bodies dumped in rivers. In Chile, a US-backed coup topples the elected socialist president Salvador Allende in 1973. In his place, General Pinochet rules with iron and blood. In Nicaragua, the leftist Sandinistas fight against the US-funded Contras, igniting a civil war that will last for years. In Guatemala, El Salvador, Argentina and Brazil, dictatorships rise, often supported quietly or openly by Washington if it means keeping the red tide at bay. The Soviets do the same, funding leftist guerrillas wherever they can. And so truth dies between crossfire, and ordinary people are forced to choose sides in wars that are not their own. Africa, the continent caught in the middle. You look to Africa and see colonial empires collapse, only to be replaced by new forms of domination. As nations gain independence, the US and USSR rush in, not with flags but with weapons and advisors. In Angola, the Portuguese leave and chaos fills the void. 3 factions rise, one backed by the Soviets and Cuba, another by the US and South Africa. The war lasts for decades. Cuba sends 36,000 troops. The CIA sends guns and money. In Mozambique, Ethiopia, Somalia and Zaire, the same story unfolds. Leaders are propped up, overthrown or assassinated, all to serve the Cold War chessboard. You realize independence does not mean freedom. It means being fought over again by different masters. The Middle East, oil, religion, and power. The Middle East becomes a vortex. The 1953 coup in Iran, orchestrated by the CIA and MI6, topples Prime Minister Mossadegh. Why? Because he nationalized oil. In his place, the Shah rules ruthlessly for 25 years, until the Islamic Revolution topples him in 1979, birthing a theocracy that hates both the Soviets and Americans. In Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, shifting alliances keep the region volatile. The US supports Israel. The Soviets back Arab nationalists. You see modern jets dogfight over Sinai. You see tanks roll through the Golan Heights. The Cold War turns sacred cities into battlefields, and when terrorism rises, it is often born from chaos the Cold War left behind. Hearts and minds. The fight, war beyond guns, but proxy wars are not only fought with bullets. They are fought in minds and hearts. The CIA runs propaganda campaigns, funds newspapers, infiltrates unions. The Soviets do the same, building schools, offering scholarships, printing. Communist literature in dozens of languages. Even aid becomes a weapon. Loans, food shipments, infrastructure, all come with conditions. You are either with us or against us. The world divides, not just by ideology but by access. To dollars or to rubles, to Pepsi or to vodka, to Hollywood or Pravda. It is not enough to kill your enemy. You must also teach others to love you more. The cost: blood, memory, and silence. By the 1980s, you begin to count the cost. Millions dead. Millions more displaced. Families destroyed. Cities reduced to ash. Generations raised in trauma, taught to hate before they learn to hope. The superpowers sign treaties, shake hands, pose for photos. But in Angola, in Cambodia, in El Salvador, children still step on landmines laid by invisible giants. The Cold War may have been cold for you, but it was scorching for others. You learn this truth. When elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Reflection. Was it worth it? You ask yourself, was it worth it? Did Vietnam fall so America could remain free? Did Soviet boys die in Kabul to protect Marxism? Was the coup in Chile worth the torture chambers? Was the war in Nicaragua worth a child soldier holding an AK-47? Neither superpower conquered the world, but both left scars on it. You were told this was a war of ideas, but in the end, it was fought in mud and blood, and the people who suffered the most never got to choose their side. The legacy of proxy. Wars long after the Cold War ends, the fires keep burning. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen fracture into warlords and extremists. In Latin America, broken democracies struggle to rebuild. In Africa, wars morph, migrate, and reignite. In the Middle East, ghosts of coups still shape geopolitics. You see the long tail of proxy war, not just destruction, but distrust. Not just death, but disillusion. Peace is harder to build than war is to wage, and the weapons left behind do not know that the war is over. Closing reflection. You never fired a shot. You never joined an army. But you were part of a world where every border was a battlefield. You learned that ideology can justify anything. Torture, invasion, silence. And you ask, could it have been different? Could the Cold War have been fought with diplomacy, not destruction? With bridges, not bullets? You may never know. But you carry the burden. Because the Cold War's loudest silence was not between the bombs that never fell, but in the screams of the people who could not choose which empire they would die for. Chapter 5. The Iron Curtain. Europe divided. You stand in the heart of Europe, where lines on a map become walls in reality. One side promises freedom, the other equality. One side raises the flag of capitalism, the other the banner of socialism. But for the people caught in between, Poles, Czechs, Germans, Hungarians, there is only the hard reality of occupation, suspicion, and control. The continent that once birthed the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the World Wars is now split by an invisible barrier. Winston Churchill calls it the Iron Curtain. But for millions, it is no metaphor. It is the life they are forced to live. A continent carved by victory, When the guns of World War II fall silent in 1945, you expect peace. You expect rebuilding. But instead, you witness a new battle begin, a spies battle not of bullets but of influence. Europe is in ruins. Cities bombed flat, borders redrawn, millions homeless. Into this vacuum step two powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They arrive as liberators, but they stay as occupiers. Germany is split. Berlin is split. Even families are split. The Allies had won the war, but in doing so, they divided its spoils. And you soon realize the victors are no longer allies, they are rivals, and Europe is the chessboard. The rise of the curtain in 1946, Winston Churchill speaks in Fulton, Missouri. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Isar, Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. It's a line that chills, and it proves prophetic. To the west, democracies, Marshall Plan aid, NATO. To the east, one-party rule, central planning, the Warsaw Pact. Czechoslovakia is the first to fall fully under Soviet influence in 1948. The communists take power in a silent coup. Hungary and Poland follow. Romania, Bulgaria, Albania. They all join the Eastern Bloc. Yugoslavia charts its own path, but remains authoritarian. Behind the curtain, the Soviet Union installs puppet regimes, crushes dissent, and builds a buffer zone of obedient states. They call it liberation, but you know it by another name, occupation. The Berlin Crisis and the Wall Berlin is a microcosm of the Cold War, divided into four sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. It lies deep in East Germany, an island of capitalism in a sea of communism. At first, the city is tense but open. Then, it becomes the fault line. In 1948, Stalin tries to starve out the western sectors by cutting off access, roads, rail, and canals. But you see the skies fill with American and British planes. The Berlin airlift begins. For nearly a year, supplies are flown in, food, coal, medicine at all hours. Planes land every 30 seconds. Stalin blinks first. The blockade ends, but the message is clear. Berlin is not just a city, it is a symbol. Fast forward to 1961. East Germans flee west by the thousands, scientists, engineers, workers. The GDR bleeds talent. Then one night the East closes the border. Barbed wire, barricades, concrete walls. Within days a city is split. The Berlin Wall rises. You see families waving from opposite sides, lovers torn apart, soldiers ordered to shoot defectors, and graffiti that says more than any speech: escape is not betrayal, silence is. 4. Life on the eastern side. If you're born in the East, your life is mapped out for you. You go to a state-run school. Your textbooks praise Lenin and Stalin. You pledge loyalty to the party. You may be watched by the secret police. You may be asked to inform on your neighbors. You may feel the quiet fear that any wrong word could end your career or your freedom. You work, yes, but you don't choose where or how. The state assigns your job, your apartment, your vacation. You don't vote in a meaningful way. The ballot has only one name. Consumer goods are scarce. Stores are gray. Bread lines are long. You wait 10 years for a car, 5 for a telephone. But there is also stability, low crime, free education, free healthcare. If you're loyal, you're safe. Still, the air feels heavy. The culture, muted. And the idea of choice becomes a distant dream. Life on the western side. In the West, capitalism blooms. Cities rebuild with Marshall Plan dollars. Factories hum. Markets flourish. You can buy Coca-Cola in Paris, Levi's in Rome, jazz records in Bonn. Democracy returns, though not without challenges. Former Nazis quietly re-enter power structures. Protests erupt. Extremism lingers. But compared to the East, the West feels alive. Art, music, film, all explode. The Beatles play in Hamburg. Picasso paints in France. You feel the pulse of freedom, but also the tension. What if the East invades? What if the bomb drops so the West arms itself? NATO grows, US troops stay, and the Iron Curtain hardens. The Watchers, Stasi, KGB, CIA, you realize the real war in Europe is fought in the shadows. In the East, the Stasi becomes the most feared institution in East Germany. Every 10th person is an informer. Your mail is opened, your phone tapped, your life recorded in files stacked floor to ceiling. The KGB operates across the bloc, ensuring compliance, punishing dissent. Dissidents vanish, writers are jailed, poets are censored. In the West, the CIA funds anti-communist parties, infiltrates unions, supports student groups. They plant stories in newspapers. They finance underground literature smuggled into the East. Espionage is everywhere. Double agents, dead drops, poisoned umbrellas. Trust is a luxury. Loyalty, a liability. Uprisings. Behind the curtain, but even walls cannot silence people forever. In Hungary, 1956, students protest for reform. Tanks roll in, thousands die. The world watches, but the West does not intervene. In Czechoslovakia, 1968, the Prague Spring begins. Dubček promises socialism with a human face. For a few months, hope blooms. Then Soviet tanks crush it. You realize that Moscow allows no deviation. The Brezhnev doctrine is clear. Once you're in the bloc, you stay in. Yet resistance grows in other ways. In Poland, workers form Solidarity, a trade union that becomes a movement. Led by Lech Wałęsa, it challenges the state without violence. The Pope, a Pole himself, lends moral power. Even behind the curtain, the idea of freedom refuses to die. The borderlands, Finland, Austria, Yugoslavia, not every country fits neatly into East or West. Finland signs a treaty with the Soviets, but maintains democracy. It walks a tightrope, neutral in name, careful in practice. Austria regains independence in 1955 on one condition: permanent neutrality. It becomes a meeting point. A Cold War Switzerland-Yugoslavia under Tito breaks with Stalin in 1948. Though socialist, it charts its own course, non-aligned, independent, fierce. These nations show that in the Cold War, there are not only two sides, but also spaces in between, but they are few and fragile. The human cost of division. The numbers cannot capture the sorrow. At least 240 people are killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Thousands more imprisoned. Countless families never reunite. Entire generations grow up knowing only surveillance, suspicion, and stagnation. On the Western side, the anxiety never fades. Children drill for nuclear attacks. Propaganda fills television screens. Bomb shelters are stocked. Everyone waits for a war that never comes, but always threatens. You live your life under a shadow, not of invasion, but of what it means to be divided, not by mountains or oceans, but by fear. The slow erosion. By the 1980s, the cracks begin to show. In the East, economies stagnate, the system creaks. People want goods, they want ideas, they want truth. Western music leaks through the airwaves. Smuggled VHS tapes show a different world. Jeans become a symbol of rebellion. In the West, peace movements grow. Nuclear protests fill the streets. Glasnost and perestroika take shape in Moscow. And slowly, imperceptibly, the Iron Curtain begins to rust, but the wall still stands. And no one believes it will fall until it does. 7. The curtain falls in 1989. The impossible happens. Hungary opens its border with Austria. East Germans flee through it. The pressure builds. In October, East Berliners take to the streets, tens of thousands. The regime falters, and on November 9th, the Berlin Wall opens. You watch as people flood across, crying, laughing, chipping pieces off the wall, dancing on top of it. For the first time in 28 years, Berlin is won again. And the Iron Curtain shatters, not with tanks, but with joy. Reflection. A Europe reunited. The Cold War divides Europe for nearly half a century. It shapes borders, ideologies, and lives. It turns cities into symbols, walls into weapons. When the curtain falls, you celebrate. But you also ask, what does unity mean? The East faces the shock of transition, capitalism, unemployment, political chaos. The West must learn that freedom alone cannot heal all wounds. Yet, despite the scars, Europe moves forward. You walk now, In a Berlin without walls, you cross borders without guards. You listen to music once banned. You read books once censored. And in your heart, you carry a lesson. Walls may fall, but the memory of division must never be forgotten. Chapter 6. Nuclear Arms and the Balance of Terror. You wake each morning with the silent knowledge that your world could end in minutes, that a button pressed in Moscow or Washington could incinerate millions before they ever understand why. That, beneath the peace you seem to live in, there lies an unbearable tension, an equilibrium built not on trust but on fear. This is the age of nuclear deterrence. This is the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. This is the balance of terror. From bombs to arsenals, the Cold War begins in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bomb is not just a weapon, it is a message, a signal to the Soviet Union that the United States now holds the most powerful tool of war ever created. But you quickly see how this monopoly fades. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb. The age of American dominance is over. By 1952, the US tests the hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful. In 1953, the USSR answers. The arms race has begun. It does not stop. You live in a time when both sides produce weapons not to use them, but to ensure the other never does. Yet each advancement brings greater danger. A faster missile, a more mobile launcher, a smaller, deadlier warhead. This is not just science, it is fear engineered. The doctrine of MAD. By the 1960s, nuclear strategy has a name: mutually assured destruction. The logic is brutal but simple. If the United States launches a first strike, the Soviet Union will retaliate with full force. If the Soviet Union attacks first, the US will respond. No side can win. Both will perish. The goal is not victory. The goal is stability through terror. To ensure this balance, you see both nations build second strike capabilities. Submarines that can fire from anywhere. Hardened missile silos deep underground. Bombers constantly in the air. Even if one side is struck, it can respond. That response is what prevents the first strike. It is a paradox. Peace through the promise of apocalypse. Living under the bomb, you grow up with air raid drills in schools, duck and cover films, fallout shelters in backyards, civil defense broadcasts, warning of nuclear attack. In the West, you fear the red button. In the East, you fear the capitalist encirclement. In both, you learn to live with the unthinkable. Children play under mushroom cloud murals. Families debate where to flee in the sky. Event of war. Cities plan evacuation routes that would never be fast enough. You may laugh nervously, you may dismiss it, but it never quite leaves you. This knowledge that your existence depends on no one making a mistake. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the fear becomes real. American reconnaissance planes spot Soviet missiles in Cuba. Nuclear, armed, just 90 miles from Florida, President Kennedy demands their removal. The world holds its breath. You live those 13 days in dread. The US imposes a naval blockade. The Soviets refuse to back down. Nuclear war seems one step away. Finally, a deal is struck. The USSR removes its missiles from Cuba. The US quietly removes its own from Turkey. You exhale, but you know how close you came. From this moment, a hotline is installed. Washington to Moscow. Red phones that may save the world. The expansion of the club, the nuclear club, grows. 52, United Kingdom. Times 60, France. Times 64, China. Each new entrant complicates the balance. Now deterrence must account not just for two rivals, but for multiple, actors with their own interests, fears, and red lines. The more hands on the trigger, the more dangerous the game becomes. You begin to wonder, how many bombs are enough? 10? 100? 10,000? By the 1980s, the US and USSR possess over 60,000 nuclear warheads combined, enough to destroy the planet many times over. Insanity dressed as security. Anti-missile and space warfare. The logic of deterrence depends on vulnerability. If one side believes it can survive a first strike, it may be tempted to strike first. So anti-missile systems threaten stability. If you can shoot down incoming missiles, you upset the balance. The US explores this in the 1980s with the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, dubbed Star Wars. Lasers in space, satellites with weapons, shields that would make nukes obsolete. But the technology is not ready, and the costs are immense. The Soviets fear it nonetheless. They invest more in missiles, more fear, more spending, more pressure. The arms race extends to the heavens. Protest and dissent by the 1970s and 80s, you see a shift. Citizens begin to question the logic of annihilation. Movements rise in the West. The campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK. The ban the bomb protests in the US, massive rallies in West Germany against nuclear deployments. Even in the East, whispers of doubt emerge. Scientists, writers, religious leaders speak of peace, music, poetry, film. They all begin to reflect the dread of nuclear death. You start to ask, what kind of peace is this if it demands our constant fear? 8 arms control begins. The threat grows so severe that both sides begin to talk. 63. The Limited Test Ban Treaty. No nuclear tests in the atmosphere. 72. SALT-I, limits on strategic arms. 79. SALT II, never ratified but followed. 87. INF. Treaty eliminates intermediate-range missiles. Each treaty is a small step, but you feel a change. It is no longer just about winning. It is about surviving. And in 1985, a new face rises in the East, Mikhail Gorbachev. He speaks of glasnost, of perestroika, of a world without war. He and Reagan meet. They talk, they laugh, and suddenly, the impossible seems within reach. Disarmament. The end of the Cold War era, as the Berlin Wall falls, so does the logic of MAD. The Soviet Union collapses. The nuclear threat recedes, but never vanishes. Warheads are deactivated. Treaties are signed. Stockpiles shrink. But you know the weapons still exist. In bunkers, on submarines, hidden beneath silence. Today they are in fewer hands, but perhaps more unpredictable ones. North Korea, Pakistan, India, and the looming threat of proliferation. Reflection. Living with the bomb, you live in a world shaped by the bomb. It has never been used since 1945, not because of morality or law, but because of fear. That fear may have saved humanity, but it is a terrible foundation for peace. As you look to the future, you wonder, can we build a world without this sword above our heads? Can diplomacy outlast paranoia? Can reason silence the countdown clock? You don't know, but you do know this. The balance of terror was never stable. It was always a gamble, and we were lucky, so far. Chapter 7. Proxy Wars and the Global Battlefield. You may have thought the Cold War was a frozen standoff between superpowers, but the real heat was felt elsewhere, in jungles, deserts, villages, and city streets. While the United States and Soviet Union never engaged directly on the battlefield, their ideologies burned through the veins of nations across the globe. You lived through these wars, not by name, but by the echoes they left behind. You heard them in the gunshots of revolution, the roar of tanks in the distance, and the whispers of fear among neighbors. This is how the Cold War was truly fought, not in Washington or Moscow, but in the hearts and blood of other people's lands. The logic of proxy conflict. When two nuclear powers cannot fight each other directly, they fight everywhere else. You see this logic unfold in the early years of the Cold War. If one nation falls to communism, the others may follow. If one dictator aligns with the West, others may resist. The stakes are global, the battlefield borderless. So the US and the USSR funnel weapons, money and ideology into every corner of the world. They use smaller nations as chess pieces, sometimes willing, often not. These nations become proxies not for conquest but for containment. Korea, the forgotten fire. In 1950, North Korean troops pour across the 38th parallel, backed by Soviet equipment and later Chinese troops. The United States, under the flag of the United Nations, rushes to support South Korea. You watch a nation torn in half. Entire cities are razed. Millions die. It is brutal, swift, and unresolved. The war ends in 1953 with an armistice, but no peace treaty. The border holds and so does the tension. To this day, the Korean War remains a shadow conflict, often forgotten, but it was the first major proxy war, and it showed the world just how quickly the Cold War could turn hot. Vietnam, the quagmire no. Conflict better symbolizes the Cold War's moral ambiguity than Vietnam. What begins as a colonial struggle against French rule morphs into a superpower conflict. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, backed by China and the USSR, face a South supported by American advisors, then troops, then bombs, then napalm. You see villages burned, protests erupting back home, soldiers drafted without choice. You hear, the body counts. The nightly news becomes a war chronicle. The line between victory and defeat blurs. By 1975, the US withdraws. Saigon falls. The North wins, but at what cost? Millions dead, generations scarred, and a lesson written in fire. Ideology cannot be imposed by force. Latin America, coups and covert operations. In Chile, 1973, you watch a democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, overthrown by a CIA-backed coup. Their military dictatorship follows. In Nicaragua, the US supports Contras against the leftist Sandinista government. In Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Argentina, violence becomes policy. Guerrillas rise, death squads answer, entire villages disappear. Overnight, the goal is not liberation but influence. The USSR fuels leftist movements, the US arms right-wing regimes, and in between, civilians pay the price. Africa, battleground of independence, Africa emerges from colonialism into the chaos of Cold War rivalry. In Angola, a civil war becomes a proxy war. The Soviets and Cubans back the MPLA. The US and South Africa back UNITA. In Congo, in Mozambique, in Ethiopia, you see new nations torn apart by old ideologies. Leaders are assassinated. Ethnic tensions explode. Hope is dashed by dictatorship and war. Africa becomes a testing ground for Cold War strategies, resource-driven, strategically ignored by global powers unless convenient. And when they leave behind weapons and ghosts. The Middle East, oil, faith, and firearms nowhere, is the Cold War more complex than the Middle East. The 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran topples Mossadegh, installing the Shah. Decades later, the revolution explodes. In Afghanistan, 1979, the USSR invades to support a friendly regime. The US responds by arming the Mujahideen. You see the same story repeat. Foreign hands stirring local fires, old rivalries inflamed by new weapons. By the time the Soviets withdraw in 1989, Afghanistan lies in ruin. The fighters America backed become something else. You know what comes next. The cultural battlefield, but proxy wars are not only military. They're cultural. The US exports Coca-Cola, jazz, jeans, and Hollywood. The USSR counters with Sputnik, ballet, and revolution songs. In classrooms, children learn history from opposite ends. In newspapers, stories contradict. In literature, and art, propaganda competes with protest. Even the Olympics become ideological duels. Victory on the field is treated like victory on the battlefield. You live not just among soldiers, but among symbols. The human cost. These conflicts are measured not in borders gained, but in lives lost, millions dead, tens of millions displaced. Orphaned children, burned villages, families torn by ideology. The scars are not just on maps, but in minds. Trauma replaces tradition. You see how Cold War rivalry destabilized entire continents. Yet for the superpowers, these wars are statistics, briefings, reports, budgets, but for the people living through them, they are everything. Resistance and non-alignment. Not all nations choose a side. India, Yugoslavia, Egypt, they lead the non-aligned movement. They seek sovereignty, peace, and development outside cold. War polarity. They resist pressure. They speak of independence, not ideology. You watch this bloc grow. It reminds you that even amid global conflict, Some still seek a path of dignity without domination. Reflection. Who really won? When the Cold War ends, many in the West celebrate. Communism, they say, has fallen. Democracy has triumphed. But you remember the graves in Vietnam, the mass graves in Angola, the broken streets of Kabul. If the Cold War was a game, the people of the proxy wars were its pieces, moved, sacrificed, and discarded. You ask who really won, not the child soldier, not the refugee, not the disappeared. The Cold War ended, but the wounds remain. Chapter 8. Espionage, Secrets, and the Shadow. War. You live in a world where truth is elusive, where facts are filtered through wires and whispers. The real Cold War, the one behind the speeches and parades, is fought in shadows. Not with armies, but with double agents. Not with bombs, but with bugs in hotel rooms and dossiers filled with secrets. This is a war waged by spy masters, cryptographers, defectors, and liars. And you, citizen of the free or the controlled world, are never quite sure who is watching or why. The Age of Secrets begins in the aftermath of World War II. Both superpowers realize that information is power, military might is visible, nuclear arsenals can be counted. But knowledge, intentions, plans, weaknesses, that is priceless. So you see the rise of institutions built for silence. In the United States, the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, formed in 1947. In the Soviet Union, the KGB, Committee for State Security, reorganized from earlier structures in 1954. These are not just intelligence agencies, they are weapons, and they are everywhere. Berlin, city of spies Berlin, divided and fragile, becomes the front line of the shadow war. You see the city as a crucible of espionage. In coffee houses, men in trench coats pass briefcases. In alleyways, dead drops are hidden beneath bricks. Tunnels are dug beneath the streets to tap Soviet phone lines. Everyone suspects everyone. East German Stasi informants are said to be so pervasive that even families spy on each other. If the Cold War has a capital of espionage, this is it. Code breakers and cryptographers beyond the human agents, you witness a war of machines. Code breaking becomes an obsession. The US develops satellites and listening posts. The British GCHQ intercepts signals from around the world. The NSA grows into a vast, secretive bureaucracy. The Soviets respond with equal ambition. Communications are encrypted, with layers of complexity. Intelligence is compartmentalized, but no system is foolproof. Each side occasionally cracks the other's code, and when they do, the effects ripple silently but powerfully. The double agents. This war has its heroes and traitors, but you're never sure which is which. In the UK, the infamous Cambridge, five-spy ring Philby, Burgess, Maclean, Blunt, and Cairncross feeds British and American secrets to Moscow for years. They are idealists to some, traitors to others. In the US, Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen betray American intelligence for Soviet money, exposing agents and causing deaths. And from the other side, Oleg Penkovsky, a colonel in Soviet military. Intelligence feeds critical data to the West, including during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are not soldiers, they are ghosts, and they change history in silence. The human cost of betrayal. For every spy celebrated in film, there are dozens who die anonymously. You read reports of agents executed in basements, of families punished for secrets passed, of defectors who disappear. Espionage is a profession of constant tension. Loyalty is never absolute, trust is temporary, and the cost of a mistake is death. Even in your own country, suspicion runs deep. McCarthy-era purges, loyalty tests, surveillance of citizens, all in the name of security. Technology and surveillance, the tools of the trade evolve. You see bugs hidden in walls, typewriters that record strokes, pens that shoot poison darts. Spy planes like the U-2 fly over enemy territory, until in 1960, one is shot down over the USSR, igniting a scandal. Later, satellites begin their silent orbit, capturing troop movements, missile tests, and construction sites from hundreds of miles above. Each advance in technology means more eyes, more ears, yet more paranoia. You learn that privacy is a myth. That in the Cold War, even your thoughts feel monitored. Propaganda as psychological warfare. Not all espionage involves secrets. Some involve spectacle. Radio Free Europe broadcasts Western news into the Eastern Bloc. Soviet media paints the West as decadent and dangerous. Propaganda becomes a second front. Films, posters, novels, all are weapons. Hollywood and Moscow alike produce stories that reinforce loyalty and vilify the other. You are bombarded with conflicting narratives. Heroes and villains switch roles depending on which side of the wall you stand. Truth becomes subjective. And that confusion is part of the strategy. Defections and escapes. One of the most dramatic elements of the spy war is defection. You hear stories of pilots flying MiGs to Japan, scientists smuggled out through diplomatic channels, opera singers who vanished during tours, the most symbolic escape, over the Berlin Wall. People build tunnels, hot air balloons, even ram through checkpoints to flee the east. Each defection is a propaganda coup. Each escape a tiny victory, but many fail, and you learn the cost of wanting freedom. Domestic spying and the enemy. Within, the paranoia does not stay at the borders. In the US, the FBI watches civil rights leaders, leftist groups, students, artists. Martin Luther King Jr. is monitored closely. In the USSR, the KGB tracks every dissident. Writers are jailed, thinkers exiled. Even speaking against the party can bring ruin. You realize that in a world so obsessed with the enemy, internal, dissent becomes indistinguishable from treason. The Cold War turns inward. Everyone is suspect. 10. The end of the shadow. War as the Cold War nears its end, the shadows begin to lift, but the networks remain. Files are burned, agents recalled, embassies emptied, but the machinery doesn't stop overnight. You learn how. Deeply intelligence-shaped global policy. How spies influenced revolutions, assassinations, alliances. Even today, echoes of this war remain in the tactics of modern surveillance states, cyber espionage, and disinformation campaigns. The Cold War's shadow never fully disappeared. It just changed form. Reflection. A world without trust. You look back and see a war not won by bullets but by secrets. A war that twisted truth, broke trust, and normalized suspicion. You wonder, how do you rebuild a world where everyone was watching? Everyone else? How do you tell truth from manipulation, sincerity from strategy? In the Cold War's longest battle, the one fought in silence, perhaps no one really won, but everyone was changed. Chapter 9. The Fall of the Soviet Union. You have lived your whole life under the shadow of two superpowers locked in eternal competition. The Soviet Union, unshakable, impenetrable, ever-present, has stood as one pole of global power. Its ideals have shaped nations. Its strength has rivaled empires. But now in real time you watch it unravel. Slowly, then suddenly the foundation cracks, the bear stumbles, the wall falls, and everything you believed permanent begins to dissolve. The cracks appear by the early 1980s. The Soviet Union is no longer the unstoppable force it once seemed. You sense it in the shortages, the stagnation, the silence that surrounds criticism. The Soviet economy, once a model of socialist ambition, is buckling under its own weight. Central planning strangles innovation, corruption festers, military. Spending soars while store shelves sit empty. You feel it, something is wrong. The system survives through inertia, but not progress. And in the West, Ronald Reagan calls your homeland an evil empire while launching a military and ideological offensive. You are not sure what's more dangerous, his rhetoric or your leader's failure to respond. The Gorbachev moment in 1985, a new leader rises, young, articulate, and different. Mikhail Gorbachev. You hear words no Soviet leader has dared speak. Glasnost, openness. Perestroika, restructuring. At first it sounds like hope. Gorbachev wants to reform the system, not destroy it. He reduces censorship, encourages limited free enterprise, begins withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. You are skeptical but intrigued. Could the USSR evolve? But reform proves a dangerous game. You cannot open one valve without pressurizing the entire machine. The truth comes flooding. In glasnost means you begin to hear stories that were once forbidden, the horrors of Stalin's purges, the Gulag camps, the mismanagement of Chernobyl. Suddenly, truth, raw, unfiltered, is everywhere. Newspapers write about once taboo topics. Films depict real Soviet failures, and with each revelation, your faith erodes. What else was hidden? What else was a lie? This is not just political reform. It is psychological revolution. The satellite states stir in Eastern Europe, the ripple becomes a wave. Poland elects a non-communist government. Hungary opens its border with Austria. East Germans pour through. You watch this with disbelief. Once, Soviet tanks would have crushed such defiance, but now Gorbachev lets it happen. The Brezhnev Doctrine, intervention to preserve socialism, is quietly buried. By late 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. You remember where you were when it happened. It is not just stone that crumbles, it is fear, dogma, division. And once Berlin falls, the rest follows. The nationalities question the Soviet Union is not one nation but many, 15 republics. Hundreds of ethnicities, dozens of languages. Beneath the banner of socialism, these identities were controlled, not erased. But now, with the center weakening, the periphery begins to pull away. In the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, independence movements surge. In Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, national pride awakens. You see old flags re-emerge. Songs once banned now fill the streets. Moscow's authority is questioned. Demands for sovereignty turn into declarations. The empire is fracturing, not by war, but by will. The failed coup, August 1991. A desperate last gasp. Hardline communists stage a coup against Gorbachev. Tanks roll into Moscow. He is placed under house arrest. You fear the worst, a return to repression. But then something remarkable happens. Thousands of citizens flood the streets. They surround the Russian White House. They refuse to be silenced, and a new figure rises, Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic. He stands atop a tank, condemning the coup. In 3 days it collapses. The people have chosen a different future. The end of the USSR. By December 1991, the Soviet Union is a shell. Republic after republic declares independence. Gorbachev tries to hold a new union together, but it is too late. On December 25, 1991, he resigns. The red flag is lowered from the Kremlin. You stare at your television screen and realize it's over. A nation that defined your life, your identity, your fears and hopes. It's gone. In its place, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Lithuania. 15 new states, all uncertain, all free. Aftershock and memory. The collapse is not clean. In some places, joy. In others, confusion. In many, chaos. Pensions vanish, inflation spirals, mafia groups rise. Former Soviet citizens wake up in new countries, sometimes without moving an inch. You mourn and celebrate at once. You long for stability, but not oppression, for unity, but not uniformity. The past becomes contested. Was the USSR a tragedy? A triumph? Both, and now without the Cold War's certainty, you are left with a harder question. What next? The global consequences for the world. This moment is seismic. The Cold War ends. The bipolar order dissolves. America stands alone as a superpower. For now, alliances shift. NATO expands eastward. Former Soviet republics seek new identities, new allies. In the West, liberal democracy seems to have triumphed. Francis Fukuyama calls it the end of history. But you know better. History never ends, it mutates. The void left by the Soviet collapse will birth new conflicts, new rivalries, and new uncertainties. 10. Reflection. The empire. That was you think of the Soviet Union not just as a state, but as a story, a dream that shaped billions of lives, a dream of equality corrupted by power, a promise of progress undone by stagnation, a vision of unity fractured by reality. You do not weep for the secret police or the censorship, But you do remember the pride, the space race, the sacrifices of war, the hope that tomorrow could be built by ordinary people. Now, as you stand in the new world, you wonder, what do we take from the past? How do we learn from a system that rose with such ambition and fell with such finality? You look around and realize the Cold War may be over, but the questions it raised remain, and your journey through its ruins is not yet done. Chapter 10. A World Reimagined. Legacy and Lessons of the Cold War. You have walked the entire length of the Cold War, from its silent beginnings in the ashes of World War II to the noisy unraveling of a bipolar world. You have seen ideologies clash, borders shift, lives lost and saved by nothing more than the promise of destruction. And now, you step into the world it left behind, a world forever marked by that long, frozen conflict. This is not a story with a clear ending. It is the start of something new. But to move forward, you must first understand the world the Cold War has reimagined. The global landscape redrawn as you emerge from the Cold War, the world map looks familiar yet transformed. 15 new nations rise from the ashes of the Soviet Union. Germany is united. Eastern Europe has shed its communist past. Borders once patrolled by soldiers now invite tourists and trade. You see a world no longer divided by the Iron Curtain, but not all is calm. Conflicts once suppressed by superpower oversight erupt anew. Civil war in the Balkans, ethnic violence in the Caucasus, territorial disputes in Central Asia. You begin to realize, while the Cold War ended, the forces it constrained have been released. The tension is different now, messier, multipolar, unpredictable. The American moment. For the first time in decades, the United States stands alone as the world's unchallenged superpower. It is a moment of triumph, but also responsibility. You watch as American ideals spread rapidly: free markets in Eastern Europe, democracy movements in Africa and Latin America, technology and culture shaping global identity. But this unipolar world breeds its own form of arrogance. Some nations see American influence not as liberation, but as domination. In 2001, you witnessed the fragile illusion of global security shatter in one morning. The 9/11 attacks remind you, power cannot prevent hatred. Supremacy does not guarantee peace. Russia's return. Russia, the largest remnant of the Soviet Union, stumbles at first. You see it gripped by corruption, oligarchy, and uncertainty. But it doesn't stay down. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia reclaims its place on the world stage, not as a communist power, but as a nationalist one. Old symbols are revived. New ambitions take root. Georgia, Crimea, eastern Ukraine. You watch as familiar tensions return, now cloaked in new language, sovereignty, NATO, influence. The Cold War may be over, but the chessboard is still set. The players remain. China's quiet rise. While the world was watching Moscow and Washington, another power was rising silently. China. Deng Xiaoping opened the door in the late Cold War. But after 1991, China transforms with astonishing speed. Factories, skyscrapers, highways. The world's workshop becomes its banker. You see the difference China has learned from the Soviet collapse. It keeps one-party rule, but embraces markets. It avoids confrontation, but builds power. And today you hear echoes of the old rivalry return, but this time between Beijing and Washington. Another Cold War? Perhaps. But this one may look very different. The nuclear shadow persists, you hoped. The bomb would vanish with the Cold War. It did not. Thousands of warheads remain. New players emerge. India, Pakistan, North Korea. You learn a new vocabulary: proliferation, rogue states, strategic deterrence. Treaties are signed, then broken. Promises made, then ignored. You understand now. The nuclear genie was never put back in the bottle. And though the fear has faded, the danger has not. The memory war. How do you remember the Cold War? It depends on who you are. In the West, a victory for freedom. In Russia, a humiliation. In Eastern Europe, a trauma. In the global South, a series of proxy betrayals. You realize history is not neutral. It is shaped by narrative. Statues fall. Archives open. Propaganda is rewritten. The Cold War becomes a canvas for each nation's self-image. Truth and myth blend. Your task now is not just to remember, but to remember wisely. The ideological. Vacuum communism did not die, but it lost its center. Capitalism won, but it grew unchecked. Globalization accelerated, inequality deepened. Without the Cold War's binary opposition, the world struggles to define itself. Is this the end of ideology, or just the start of something more fragmented? You see populism rise, nationalism return, extremism mutate. In the absence of a Cold War, the world did not find peace. It found disorientation. Cold War echoes in the digital age. The world you now inhabit is not divided by walls but by algorithms, not by ideology but by information, cyber warfare, disinformation, surveillance states. You realize the Cold War's tools have evolved. Propaganda becomes viral content. Spies become hackers. Espionage is conducted through code, not couriers. The battlefield is no longer Berlin or Hanoi. It's your phone, your data, your mind. And once again you wonder, who controls the truth? Lessons and warnings. What has the Cold War taught you? That peace through fear is unsustainable. That ideology can blind as much as it inspires. That humanity is always one mistake away from catastrophe. But also, that diplomacy can prevent annihilation. That individuals, scientists, artists, protesters can shape history. That even in the darkest decades, people hoped, dreamed, and resisted. You carry those lessons forward, not as relics, but as tools. Looking forward. The Cold War did not end the way wars usually do. No treaty, no surrender, just a collapse and a sigh. You now live in the world it left behind. It is yours to shape. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Cold War is this. It showed what the brink looks like and what stepping back feels like. It proved that survival is possible, but never guaranteed. So now, as new powers rise, as new rivalries form, as old ghosts stir, you ask, can we do better this time? Can we build peace without paranoia, security without supremacy? You do not know. But this time you begin with memory, and memory is the beginning of wisdom.